As I indicated before, this is really a condensed version. This is something that in the turfgrass insects we actually have about 5 or 6 lectures on turfgrass insects. The other thing that I'm going to be giving you is what I call my introduction to integrated pest management. This next session that I'd like to talk about is integrated pest management. We use that IPM. This is kind of the basic general definition that you would find in most textbooks. You'll find all kinds of versions of this, but in essence, the first thing that I want you to see here is that IPM, I get people calling me all the time and they say, Dr. Shetlar, can you tell me an IPM program for turf? And I joke with them, I say, there is no such thing. You know, well, what do you mean? You know, that's what everybody's talking about it. IPM is a process. And I take it even further, it's a decision-making process. And what that means is that for every year, every condition, things change. And so you have to be adept enough at changing your processes, your thinking. What is it that you need to be doing and reacting to the different pest pressures that are going on? And so it's a process. And in this process, what I'm going to be trying to do is, number one, figuring out how many pests do I have. In other words, do I need to do something about these pests or not? And that's another tenet of IPM. Mere presence of a pest doesn't mean you have to do anything. You don't have to control them. Just because you find one dandelion doesn't mean that you have to control that dandelion. On the other hand, if you have 100 dandelions out there, you probably say, yeah, I probably have to control that. And it's the same thing. We know that 4 or 5 grubs per square foot are not going to damage the turf. But if I get to 6 to 7 grubs per square foot, I'm still not going to see any turf damage, but guess what? Skunks and raccoons are going to dig up the turf. Okay? If I get up to 10 grubs per square foot, now I'm going to lose turf from that. So as you can see, there's different thresholds in there. There's a threshold I don't need to worry about. There's another threshold that I need to worry about if I've got skunks and raccoons in the area. And then there's another threshold where I better get out there pretty quick. I'm going to lose turf. When we make that decision, and that's based on what we call these economic, ecological, sociological consequences, I also have to remember that we tend to always reach for the insecticide container or the pesticide. But in IPM, we also ask the question, are there some biological controls that I can use here? Are there some cultural controls that I've used? Now, I've already given you some hints for these. What would be a cultural control that you could use to keep from having bill bug damage showing up? Do you remember that? What are the two things? Lots of bill bugs and drought cause turf death. So how could I cover that up? Irrigate it. Yeah, if I've got a good irrigation system during that period of time, not going to see bill bugs. So that would be a cultural control. Adding more water into that situation is going to overcome that. Another thing that I talked about, and we include this in cultural control, if I've got chinch bugs in Kentucky bluegrass, I know if I switch to perennial ryegrass or turf-type tall fescue that have the endophyte, I won't have any chinch bugs any longer. They can't survive the toxins that are on there. And so I need to be thinking about, what are some short-term things I can do? What are some long-term things that I can do? Sometimes it's easier maybe to say what something isn't as opposed to what it is. In spite of my environmental friends that think biological control is the answer to everything, IPM is not a biological control program. Biological control is just one component. It's one of the tactics that we can sometimes use. It's not an organic program. I have nothing against organic materials, but as a scientist, I require organic materials to perform. In other words, I'm not just going to use an organic product just because I think it's nice and greener and so forth. It has to do what I want it to do. And in the case of an insecticide, if I'm going to use an organic insecticide, it needs to work. I don't want to spend a lot of money on something that doesn't work. What we find in IPM is that when we use IPM, we often reduce pesticide usage between 60 and 80%. That's not the goal of IPM. The goal of IPM is to grow a good crop, or in our case, grow healthy turf, and minimize the pest damage in there. And so IPM still uses as one of its tools chemical controls. It's still there, but what we find is we do monitoring, sampling, and cultural controls and biological controls. We often reduce the need for our chemical controls. I wish I could make IPM the Kmart or Walmart way of managing turf. But the reality is, what we find is when you implement IPM, the cost stays the same. In other words, you will trade the cost of your chemical controls and your regular chemical controls for a cost of doing more sampling and monitoring and doing just spot treatments and more narrow treatments. So in essence, you can pretty well hold the expense pretty level, but now what you're doing is investing your time in people making decisions and monitoring and using their expertise, rather than just going out and applying a pesticide because they think it's the right time. Again, I need to emphasize this is an ongoing process. Every year is different. Every year has a different set of insects that seem to be more important than the previous year, and other sets of insects that are less important than the previous year. We also need, here we need to understand, we are trying to work with the environment. We want to make sure that we're not destroying things by applying pesticides where they're not needed. But I'm here to tell you, I can control most insects organically. But to do it, it's going to cost me 3 to 4 times what it would cost if I included some other types of controls in the system. So one of the things I have to do is take a look at the economics on here. And we find, especially in the lawn care, there are people that have different sociological values. And what are we talking about? There are some people that say, I want my lawn maintained organically. Okay, it's going to cost you more. We can do that. Okay, and so you've got to watch out for that. What I'm finding even in the golf course situation is that many golf course superintendents end up in municipalities. And if you're in a city park golf course or a city run golf course, quite often they will state, we want to reduce our pesticide footprint. And so I want you to use other materials and other things if at all possible, and then you have to document why you had to go back to the pesticide. That's a value that they've adopted, and so you might have to live within those different values. We base our pest management on monitoring and sampling. Are the pests really here? And do they really need to be controlled? And we always have to ask that question. Yeah, I've got this great pesticide, but can I use some cultural controls? Can I use some biological controls? The real problem that we've had with integrated pest management is that integrated pest management was originally developed for field crops, fruits, and vegetables. Now, what's the difference between field crops, fruits, and vegetables, and turf grass? Do you eat your turf grass? No. So in essence, turf grass is a perennial crop, in quotations, and we don't harvest it for money. We utilize it, we play on it, we use it for the looks and so forth. So and basically we're talking about an aesthetic crop as opposed to a crop that we can sell for money. The other thing that we find that's typical in urban areas, especially in people's home yards and back lawns and things, they don't like bugs around. And they just want you to kill everything off. They don't mind their puppy dog and their kitty cat and their kids running around, but heaven forbid that they would have a millipede or something like that come walking out of that lawn and getting into their houses. Now, when you're dealing with the ornamental plants, we have another situation going on in that urban habitats are extremely diverse. There's easily, here on campus, just look around campus here, there's easily 100 different species of plants. And each one of those plants has got insects and diseases and weed issues with it. And you compare that to, let's say, a cornfield, a soybean field, where you're growing one not only one species of plant, but now one cultivar of plant in that particular area, and you've got a limited number of insects, limited number of diseases, and a limited number of weeds that you deal with that. So it becomes much more difficult in these urban areas. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, there were some entomologists in the eastern part of the United States that said, we really would like to try to develop IPM in these urban areas, and how do we do it? And they started doing the analysis too, and said, my God, potentially 100 different plants. If each of those plants has 1 to 5 insect or mite pests on it, this is going to be mind-boggling. Well, Mike Raup and his other researchers at the University of Maryland actually did this. They went into a new neighborhood. This was a coveted neighborhood. The neighborhood bought in that, yes, they would use IPM. And what they found is that, indeed, there were those 100 plants that were in there. But what they found is out of those 100 plants, there were only 5 or 6 of those plants that seemed to have about 90% of the pest issues on them. Then they also, and what they said, oh, we're going to identify those as key plants. If you've got a hybrid tea rose in your yard, that's a key plant. It's always going to have pests, always going to have diseases. You're always going to be fighting to keep it alive. Okay? If you've got a European white bark birch, that's a key plant. It's always going to be killed. Something's going to happen to it, and so forth. They also said, we're identifying what we consider to be key pests, and this really rocked the industry because the industry made a lot of money out of spraying, let's say, aphids on the leaves of trees. Well, what do aphids on the leaves of trees do? They don't even eat the leaves. They suck some juice out of the leaves and they drop a little bit of honeydew on, but the plant usually goes on just fine. In other words, it's not going to be significantly damaging to the plant. On the other hand, if I get a borer under the bark of that same tree, that borer has the potential of killing that tree if it gets all the way around it and girdles it. So which one should I spend more time worrying about? The borer, obviously. The aphids are more of a nuisance situation, and so they were saying we need to watch out for the things that can really seriously damage the plant or outright kill it. Right now, this is where most of us are moving. The thing that I found a little disconcerting about IPM is that there was all this emphasis on monitoring the insects, monitoring the pests, and determining whether I needed to control them or not. What got lost was the plant. And the reality is, we know, we've learned over the years that if I've got a plant that has the proper site, in other words, it's got the proper moisture, sun, and the rest of it, and it's got enough water and nutrition, the plant will fend for itself just fine. It usually will not get into trouble. And so what we find is that plants under stress are usually the ones that get most of the, they get diseases, they get insects, and they get weed encroachment when they're under stress. And so what we decided to do is take a look at a different type of model. Now, what else have I put in the middle of this model besides the plant? The owner of that plant. And especially in urban areas, you've got to be cognizant that every homeowner has a different idea of what they think they want out of their plant. And so you have to pay attention to that. And here's what I'm talking about. I've moved into a new neighborhood over here in Hilliard, and everybody's fertilizing the crud out of their trees and shrubs. Why? They want them to grow up and look like mature trees and shrubs in their landscape. Again, I don't have any problem with that. However, once those trees grow up, will they reduce the fertilizer inputs to that? What I often find is that they got into this habit of every spring putting fertilizer and every fall putting fertilizer, but once the tree reaches a certain size, quit it. It doesn't need it anymore. It's already reached the maximum size that you want for that landscape. Now, obviously, what we're now looking at here is are there stresses? Is this plant showing a stress? Lack of color, lack of growth, and so forth. We evaluate that, and when we see that, how do we intervene? Is it a cultural thing where it does need more water or better soil conditions or more fertilizer? or in some cases the intervention in this particular case, this is where IPM might be. If I do find that there's a pest that has arrived that requires my intervention, that's where I'm going to stick my integrated pest management decision now. Now, another thing that we often see is people are talking about reduction of inputs in urban areas, and here's this one sort of falls under the plant healthcare syndrome, the xeriscaping. I call it zero-scaping. This is actually a front lawn in Albuquerque, New Mexico. When I was out there a few years ago, there were whole neighborhoods that looked exactly like this. What I find is interesting, what do you think's behind this privacy fence? Two things. Yeah, there's the most beautiful Kentucky bluegrass lawn you've ever seen. Immaculate. Now, how in the world can you grow Kentucky bluegrass in Albuquerque, New Mexico? It's high altitude. Yeah, it gets cool. Every evening it cools down. It's really a very good growing condition, even though in the daytime it gets really hot. We turn the irrigation system on and so forth. The other thing that's behind that privacy fence is the obligatory swimming pool. Okay? Now, what I'm getting at, do you think these people spend much time in this front lawn? No. It's not a fun place to... Now, as an entomologist, that's a great place for me, because I know there's scorpions in there, and I know there's tarantulas in there and so forth, and I can find them. What I also find is kind of interesting, there's been some studies that have come out now. If you'll notice around each one of these plants, there's basically a moat. So what's at the base of every one of those plants? Trickle tube irrigation. And they've started to do some water audits on these. Even though those are desert plants, they will take as much water as you give them. And why are they watering them? Well, they have better color, they have better growth and better form when you give them a daily water dose. And they've actually done some water audits of these, and many of these front lawns were using as much or more water than the backyard was. Okay? So it's and what I find is even more interesting, which of these are native plants in the front? Well, this scrub oak is a native plant, and this plant right here is a native plant. All the rest of it, that's a sage bush that's there. All the rest of this is actually South and Central America plants that were brought up. Why are they using those? They have more shape and form and color and so forth. And so while they were so-called desert plants and they can survive in this, they're doing even better with lots of water and fertilizer. Now, if we take a look at that integrated pest management, going back to there, and again, what I wanted to point out to you there is that if you take a look at that plant health care, what was really going there was a client's, quote, need to be environmentally friendly in this weird landscaping situation. If we go back to integrated pest management, this is the classic look of IPM. If you'll notice here that the pests, whether they're insects, diseases, or weeds, at the central part of this, along with some monitoring, and what we surround this with is our control tactics, chemical controls, culture controls, and biological controls. And so in essence, we're trying to move more to that plant health care, and actually we're still keeping IPM, but IPM technology and conceptions are used only when they're really needed. Now, the last one that I'd like to sort of end this with is I've touched briefly on cultural control and chemical control. And the chemical control, I've talked about some timing of some of the insecticides to be used. But what about biological control? A lot of people figure that this is the real hope for the future. When it comes to me as an entomologist, classical biological control means that I'm going to use predators, parasites, and diseases. And when I say diseases, these are diseases that the insects get that are pathogenic to them. I also have to separate, there's a lot of confusion on this. Am I talking about a biological control or a bio-based control? And here's the real difference. A biological control is a predator, parasite, or pathogen that completes its life cycle by eating and or killing the host insect. And so if I look at this, now the milky disease of white grubs, this is a bacterium that basically infects a white grub. Once it infects the white grub, it will reproduce in the body of the white grub, and where maybe a couple of dozen spores start the initial infection, the end result is that there will be about 40 to 50,000 new bacterial spores that result in the death of that white grub. Then those spores can remain dormant in the soil until another grub comes by and eats them and ingests them, and then the infection starts over again. Okay? That's a true biological control. A lot of people talk about this Bacillus thuringiensis as being a biological control. The reality is Bacillus thuringiensis is a soil-dwelling microbe. It actually feeds on decaying organic matter. But there are certain strains of Bacillus thuringiensis that have a toxin in them, this delta endotoxin. And so when a caterpillar eats some Bacillus thuringiensis, it actually digests the bacteria. It kills the bacteria. But what the bacteria says, I'll teach you to kill me. I'm going to release this toxin in your gut. This toxin basically attaches to the gut cell lining of the caterpillar, pokes a hole in it, and that allows the gut cell contents to spill out into the body of the caterpillar, causes a secondary infection, and the caterpillar dies. Okay? So in that case, there's no cycling of this bacteria. It's not reproducing inside of that. But we can grow this bacteria in giant fermentation tanks by the thousands of gallons of this, and then have you use it to spray it out. When the caterpillars eat it, they get killed. So it really is acting like an insecticide, but it's an insecticide that the toxin is derived from a bacterium. In other cases, we don't even do that one. Here, the spinosyn, you can only buy spinosins as a refined insecticide on the market. But where did that insecticide come from? It actually came from another soil-dwelling microbe. And so we can grow the microbe, and in this particular case, spinosins are actually an excretory byproduct of this bacteria. And so we can cultivate this, we can grow it up, we can extract out this waste material that it produces, refine it down, and use it as an insecticide. Now, do you turf students know any fungicides that are similar to that? Oh my. That will be one of your assignments. There indeed is a whole category of fungicides that are very important, that are microbially based. Okay? And so look them up. I think you'll be surprised.